So I'm going to show you how to scatter a geometry over another geometry. So let's use a plane first. Okay, so most of the time when we scatter geometry, we'll be scattering foliage. Okay, which here AEC extended max comes with quite a few. So for today, I'm going to make a leafy tree. Okay, so the good thing about foliage is that you can control some stuff like the height. It's good for mid-ground, background, and foreground. Okay, and you can go with the leaves or without or whatever. So if you don't like the or you just want to create a few versions of the tree, you can just clone it. Okay, notice that when it's not selected, I have the option of just viewport canopy mode. So max doesn't display the leaves, which saves your viewport time. Okay, and you can also drop your level of detail to low, medium, or high, and then just pump it up back to high when you're rendering. So because I want to change some stuff here, so I'm going to make a copy. So foliage 2. Okay, so if I want a new look, I'll just enter a different number. So to compare the looks, I'm going to use always display, never display canopy mode, so I can see the full leaves for now. Okay, so looks quite similar, so I'm going to do different height or something. Okay, so let's say I'm happy, so I'm going to move them outside and put this guy back to canopy mode and select the tree, foliage 2, go to compound object and go to scatter. Okay, so it will create a new object and pick the distribution object, which is our plane. So let's do this. So you can see that the tree moved over. Okay, and when I go back to my modifiers panel, I can see that I can either distribute it as a copy or an instance. Okay, so most of the time we just want to use instances, and you can, most of the time I'll just use distribution objects and how many duplicates. So we'll just do like 27 or okay, so it can get pretty big pretty quickly. I'm hitting 7 on my keyboard. I'm seeing that they are like, ooh, okay, number of polys and vertices, and you can scale them all up, all down or all up. Okay, let's change this back to like 8 or 6 trees. Okay, and you can scale them after you've distributed them. Okay, I don't really know what this does. Okay, so sort of like explodes the plant. Okay, I'm gonna add a noise. Okay, these are the few things that you can do. Even distribution, so it will try to stay even. You can distribute across an area, which it may bunch up in certain parts. Skip and yeah, I have not tried this, so you might wanna. Almost looks like a skip every other area or something. So okay, so then you can have random faces and all that. So most of the time I'll just use area, and the next thing you can do is to use selected faces. So if in my, I'll just deselect this guy, you may not want to show the whatever this plane you're seeing is not the actual plane. Okay, I think somewhere in here you can hide and then actually show the actual plane. So I actually want to select my plane, so select, poly select. So if I select a few faces, like just these faces, I can control my planting of trees. Okay, so I'll just leave this selected. Okay, and go and select something else. Okay, so leave this selected at the top of my stack, and inside the foliage tool, if I use selected faces only, it will respect that selection and just plant. So if you have buildings or obstacles that you don't want your foliage to be planted, you can just select those faces that okay. So you can use a rotation to make variations from your trees. You can use local translation. Most of the time it's just translation on face. So most of the time you do translation on the face. A and B is two directions, like UV, U and V, and then N would be the normal, away from the face. So some trees would offset up and down. Okay, A would be in one direction and B would be in another direction. So yeah, you would rotate trees like that, and then scaling, most of the time you will not expect ratio unless you want to scale those trees to have some kind of variation on the height of the trees. Okay, so that's pretty good, and you can see that Max gives us a lot of opportunities to use things like that. The other thing that I want to show would be vertical. So in my plane, I want to do a noise and rough up the surface. Noise operator. Okay, and $15, 120 and 5. Okay, so that's the plane, and then I still leave it for poly select. So my trees are on. Okay, actually just let's take away the poly select, and no trees are planted because the trees were configured to plant on selected faces. So don't use selected faces, and we see our trees again. And when I select my plane again, okay, so I intentionally rough my plane up so you can see that the trees are sort of normal to the plane. So if I go to my over here, if you don't put perpendicular to the face, you will see that all your trees are sort of facing up. So that's one more thing that you can control. So now let's try and using the same plane plant the other kind of tree if we want to. So we go back to scatter and pick our distribution object, which is the plane again. And you can see now from that same plane we have two different kinds of So I'm guessing that you can do as many as you like. Okay, so we've got two variations of plants growing on the same plane. So the second plant, because of the another instance of scatter, you would have another opportunity to configure your distribution, your sizes, and your randomization. So it's quite good. If you don't like the distribution, you can just hit the unique random seed, just like how you would randomize your trees. Okay, so there isn't really any way to stop collision of two different kinds of plants. So the only thing that you can do is to enter a different number each time, and hope that and pick one that has the least number of clumping together. Okay, so yeah, I think the use transforms only sort of temporarily stops that distribution, stops the instantiating of so many plants. So it's good. Save resources on your scene. When you're ready to render, then you can just put back to use distribution object. Okay, so then this works with single piece geometry. So we could put like multi-plane textures of trees, and as long as or multiple objects combined together using multi-sub materials. The thing is just to get them into a single mesh, and then you can scatter away all you like. So I hope you like this tutorial. Goodbye.